Today we are going to talk about various schools of thoughts in psychology. What I will do is initially I will share a list with you, and thereafter we will one by one go through various schools of thoughts. What was the major concepts or major theories given by that school of thought, those we would discuss. But you would realize that few of the schools of thoughts we would venture through, glide through very swiftly, very quickly. Few schools you might realize that we are devoting little more time, and in some of cases I will just tell you that fine, these are the major things, but we would be talking about these when we come in the forthcoming lectures on various topics. If you look at the antecedents in psychology, you can just divide the major schools of thoughts in following categories: the pre-scientific phase, where you have the philosophical, empiricist, nativist and associationism. Then you have the experimental psychology phase, and then started coming the major schools of thoughts like structuralism, functionalism, associationism, behaviorism, gestalt psychology, psychoanalysis, field psychology, hormic psychology, dynamic psychology, humanistic and existential psychology, cognitive psychology. So, these are the major schools of thoughts that determine the course of action in this very subject during certain phase in history. Now, if you look at the pre-scientific phase, primarily you will have the philosophical state, the empiricist state, the nativism and the associationism, and various psychologists you will find they have given various types of concepts, primarily soul, mind, body. These were the issues that you would find being discussed largely in the pre-scientific phase. But couple of things you would find very interesting, like if you go through the work of Descartes, you would realize that he did talk about nerves as hollow tubes which carried animal spirit in different directions. He did conceive human body as a machine, and he said that animals basically are automata which does not have soul. They are machines with reflexes, instincts and other automatic actions. So, he was making a distinction between animals and humans, and he said that body, when you refer to body, it basically refers to all that is inanimate, and if you refer to soul or mind, that refers to the fact that it has it is basically a thinking substance that has power. Body that consisted of the extended matter, and the soul consisted of the unextended matter. So, this is a very interesting type of concept being proposed at that point in time, so long back, where the focus was although on mind body, this very issue, but then there was the reference to the fact that human body has nerves. Nerves are hollow tubes in which the animal spirit flows in various directions. And then you would realize that much later, clinically it was realized that yes, we do have arteries and veins, and of course, it is not the animal spirit, but it is basically the blood, the oxygenated and the deoxygenated blood that moves in those nerves, and they are of course tubular in structure. So, this is very interesting, that is the reason I thought that we should talk about it here. If you look at the work of Leibniz once again in the pre-scientific psychology, he talked about monads, and he said that monad is basically the element of all being and it is a point of force. It is indestructible, uncreatable, immutable, okay, but it is not static. And he said that the world is an infinite pluralism of independent monads. Okay. He went on to say that while individual monads have certain degree of consciousness, and the degree of consciousness provides extent of clarity to reflect upon things in totality. Okay. Monads which have poor degree of consciousness are unconscious. So, there is a reference to conscious and unconscious with reference to monads that Leibniz talked about long back. He went on to say that the low degree of consciousness, okay, basically leads to what he called as little perception, and monads with high degree of consciousness, they produce very obvious and perceptible activities. Much later in psychology, okay, especially when psychoanalytic phase came, at that time no, there was heavy emphasis on the conscious and the unconscious mind, but yes, Leibniz did talk about it long back. Leibniz in that very phase also talked about parallelism, where he said that mind monads and body monads, they follow parallel course, okay. And then you realize that it was basically not Freud who coined the idea of unconscious, rather it was Leibniz. Okay. So, that is the reason we had referred to Rene Descartes and Leibniz here. If you look at the whole work done in the stage what we are referring to here as experimental psychology, you would find basically the work done in the area of psychophysics, neurophysiology, phrenology, localization of the brain functions. If you remember localization of the brain function, we had talked about when we even came to major milestones in psychology. Then of course, reflex action and reaction time, sense physiology, evolution, and what is called as psychology of genius. Okay. On the left hand side you find a couple of names written there, Weber and Fechner, who get the credit of establishing and doing empirical work in what is called as psychophysics, Bell, Magendis and Muller working in the area of neurophysiology. Okay. So, one by one we would go through all of them, and very succinctly we will see what were the major thoughts, what were the major concepts, what were the major hypotheses or theories that was proposed in that very phase. So, of course, as I said that Weber and Fechner, their work is considered as psychophysics, and psychophysics basically investigated the quantitative relationship between the physical stimulus and the resulting psychological experience. In fact, when we will come in the next week on the topic of perception, there also we will be talking about Weber's law. What Weber basically said is that the psychophysical experiments, okay, you can have three types of experiences that it can lead to. One, the experience of temperature sense, the touch sense and the muscle sense. Okay. And his work basically led to the discovery of what is called as 2-point threshold. Okay. And 2-point threshold, he found that it is not constant for different part of the body. So, certain sensitive parts of the body like the tip of the finger, here the 2-point threshold is very small, whereas certain other part of the body, say for example the back of the body, okay, the 2-point threshold is very large. So, 2-point threshold basically would mean that, say if you take a forceps, if you take two sharp edged object and if you prick it here, see 2 points which are very close, if you just put it here, you feel that even though physically the distance between the 2 points is minimal, you can still sense it at the tip of the finger, simply because this is one of the most sensitive parts of the body. Whereas the same thing when you touch at the back, you realize that fine, it is only one point which is touching your body. So, this was the concept of 2-point threshold, and Weber gets the credit for coming forward with this. And of course, he talked about what is called as Weber's law, where he said that the ability to discriminate small differences in stimuli basically depends not on the intensity of the stimuli alone, but on the ratio between the difference and the standard weight. Okay. And we will be talking about Weber's law with interesting example when we come to the next week, when we would be talking about perception. And at that time we would also be talking about JND, what is called as just noticeable difference. I am not going into the details right now, because the next week we would be talking about all these things. Then the other important person in the area of psychophysics was Fechner, and basically it is Fechner who is considered as the father of psychophysics. He came forward with three methods, okay, what are called as psychophysical methods. First method, the method of limit; second, the method of constant stimuli; and third, the method of average error. So, basically what he said, that in the method of limit, the observer can be presented a series of either increasing or decreasing stimuli, where the intensity of the stimuli either incrementally changes, both in either direction, either it could increase or decrease, until there is a change that the observer's they respond by saying yes or no. Okay, this was considered as the method of the limit that he proposed, and he did come forward with the concept of RL and DL, okay, the raised limit and the difference limit. Okay, and raised limit and difference limit, again we would be talking about it when we come in the next week to perception. So, magnitude of the stimulus, if you are able to perceive it at least 50% of the time, it is considered at raised limit, and the smallest change in the stimulation that you can detect 50% of the time, that is called as difference limit. The details of it will come in the next week. The second method that he proposed was the method of constant stimuli, and he said that on each trial the observer receives one stimulus selected from a set. So, for discrimination of the raised limit, the observer responds with yes or no on each trial, whereas for the discrimination of the DL, the observer responds with greater than or less than as compared between the test stimuli and the standard one. The third method, that was the method of average error. Here the observer adjusts a continuous variable stimulus so that it becomes equal to the standard stimulus. Here each trial consists of an adjustment from a point of obvious inequality to a level that appears to be subjectively equal. And Fechner of course came forward with a law which is popularly now considered as Fechner's law, wherein if the intensity of the physical magnitude to the stimulus increased in the geometric order 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. So, 1 and 2, the double of it, 2 to the 4, 4 plus 4 8, 8 plus 8 16. So, it is increasing in geometrical order. The resulting increase in the sensation magnitude of just noticeable difference takes place in arithmetic order, means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. This is called Fechner's law. Fechner also gets the credit of talking about identity hypothesis, again referring to mind body problem. He said that mind and body are related to each other in the same way as the inside and outside of a circle, which are opposite side of the same line. Okay. Then the second phase that you find in experimental psychology was neurophysiology. Magendis, we referred to his work yesterday when we were talking about measure milestones. Three different things you would find here. Charles Bell, he talked about the distinction between the sensory nerve and the motor nerves. Bell and Magendis, they came forward with a law, what is called as Bell-Magendis law. This law says that the sensory nerve communication signals from external and internal environment to a spinal cord, okay, is through the dorsal route, whereas the motor nerve that carries signal from the spinal cord to the muscle, okay, to initiate some action response, that is through the ventral route. And they also talked about an interesting phenomena talking about the direction of flow. So, they said that the conduction in the nerve fiber always occurs in only one direction, what was called as law of forward direction. This was the phase when the doctrine of specific energy was talked about, which said that specific nerves are stimulated by appropriate stimuli and not by any other stimulus. The same stimulus may produce different sensation according to the nerve it stimulates. Okay. And the concept of nervous cycle was also talked about, saying that sensation from muscles are necessary for better motor control. Muller gave the doctrine of a specific nerve energy, and it was Alexander Humboldt who also went ahead talking about the phenomena of nerve impulse, where he talked about the intrinsic and the bimetallic electricity. Then came an interesting phase that talked about phrenology. This was an interesting phase where a very new concept was proposed. Gall gave this doctrine of phrenology, and he basically said that different psychological functions, they basically depend on specific regions of the brain. So, if you utilize certain area of the brain, okay, then that concerned area would expand and therefore, it would push the brain out. So, basically even if you touch your head, you will find bumps here and there on the head. So, some crusts and some tufts. So, places where you find there is a bump, according to Gall, basically that very area of the brain is under control of certain functions wherein you have developed extreme expertise, and therefore, that area has expanded, and this expansion has led to push the brain forward. But very interestingly, initially it got so much of attention, but then slowly and slowly people said that fine, this is not true. The fourth interesting work that came forward in this phase was the localization of the brain functions, and of course, Paul Broca, we referred to him when we were talking about major milestones. Rolando came forward with the concept of cerebral hemispheres, and he said that cerebral hemispheres are the principal centers for all higher mental functions. Okay. And he did go ahead suggesting that sensations are basically localized in medulla oblongata. Then Florence suggested that cerebellum is the seat for coordination of and control of the movement, and medulla is the center for nervous system. Okay. He also talked about spinal cord, which was responsible for conduction of the nerve impulse. And finally, it was Paul Broca who succeeded suggesting the centers on the left side of the hemisphere, okay, which are basically which basically controls the speech, okay, and on his name this area is named as Broca's area. Okay. Then came another stage when reflex action and reaction time was the focus, and Marshall Hall was the person who did this work. Marshall Hall talked about bodily movements, and he said that there are 4 types of movements that you find: voluntary, respiratory, involuntary and reflex movements. He said that voluntary movement basically depends on conscious and the action of the cerebrum. Okay. So, it is a conscious process completely under the control of the cerebrum. On the other hand, respiratory movements basically depend on medulla oblongata and they are involuntary. He suggested that involuntary movement basically depends upon muscular irritability produced by direct stimulation. Further, he said that reflex movements depend on spinal cord and are independent of brain and consciousness. Bessel proposed that the difference between any two observer may be due to the innate personal difference in ability to make perceptual discrimination. Okay. And Bessel, of course, he was very much interested in astronomy. So, now based on astronomical observations, he led to the new field of experimental psychology, where he talked about complication experiments and reaction experiments. Complication experiments basically they involved processes from more than one sense organ, whereas in the case of reaction experiments, the absolute personal equation was measured. Okay. So, this was an interesting thing that he came forward with, and he also suggested that given an impulse, okay, everybody would take time to form a response. Then came sense physiology. Basically, this was the area when the conduction, speed and color vision was studied at length. Helmholtz he came forward with the speed of nerve conduction, and he said that the speed of nerve impulse is approximately 90 feet per second. He invented ophthalmoscope through which he could directly look into the eyes of the participants, and young Helmholtz theory of color vision came, which is also called as trichromatic theory, where he talked about 3 pure colors: red, green and blue. He said that 3 kinds of specific fibers within the optic nerve are there, which are responsive to different wavelengths. Okay. And he suggested that we also see mixed colors. So, when the 3 primary colors are balanced, we see white or we see grey. He talked about resonance, what is called as harp theory, where he talked about the inner ear and the basilar membrane there, and how basilar membranes are attached to nerve fibers, and these nerve fibers finally go to the auditory area in the brain. And he did talk about the fact that the fibers, they are capable of responding to a specific tones, pitches and loudness. He also talked about the unconscious inference, and his doctrine of unconscious inference suggested that our resulting perceptual experience contains something which is neither contributed by a stimulus nor by receptors, rather our past experience contribute to this in unconscious way. And the major characteristics of unconscious inference, he said that it is basically irresistible. So, when we perceive, the resulting perceptual experience do come immediately. Edward Hering gave this opponent process theory, or what is also called as opponent color theory, where he talked about the set of receptors, black white the first set, green and red the second set, and blue and yellow the third set, and he said that red, blue, green and yellow, they are the 4 primary colors. He also talked about the function of the receptor, where he said that assimilation or catabolic phase, these are the 2 phases, where in one case the building up process takes place, that is the assimilation or the anabolic phase. The second is the tearing down, okay, the catabolic phase. And he said that the person never sees red, green or blue, yellow, but it is possible to see reddish blue or greenish yellow. Charles Darwin's work, all of us know, the famous work on evolution. He gave the theory of evolution, talked about variations, talked about species, survival of the fittest, and finally it was Galton who came forward with what is called as psychology of genius. Basically he said that individual greatness, they usually follow the family line, okay, although his work was not accepted later on, but he proposed this very concept that outstanding abilities or powerful mental functions are basically inherited. And of course, he talked about the fact that fingerprints are the foolproof way of identification. So, although his theory of eminence and outstanding ability, which has a genetic origin, this was discarded, but fingerprint as a foolproof way of identification, still you find that that is being used. And if you recollect when we were talking about major milestones, we had talked about the seminal work of Sir Francis Galton, the techniques that he led to, especially the questionnaire and all those things. And basically it is Galton's view that led to the foundation of psychometrics that we use so generously nowadays. Then came the third important school of thought, what is called as structuralism. William Wundt is given the credit of being the father of structuralism, and the important people were Brentano, Stampf, Muller, Kulpe. They are called the early structuralist, whereas Titchener is considered as modern structuralist. Wundt basically talked about the science of experience. According to him, there are 2 types of experiences, mediate experience and immediate experience. So, experience that is used as a way to locate something other than the experience itself is mediate, whereas if you are experiencing as such, then it is immediate in nature. And he said that psychology is basically the study of immediate experience or the conscious experiences. And he suggested that consciousness is atomistic in nature. By atomistic in nature, he basically meant that it has 2 components, sensation and feeling. Sensation, which is the objective component of the consciousness, and feeling is the subjective component of consciousness. Okay. And he said that images occur when sensations, they blend together. He also gave this feeling components, the dimensions of it, and he said that there are 3 dimensions: excitement, calm, these are bipolar, tension, relaxation, and pleasure, displeasure. And similarly, he said that there are 2 attributes of sensation and feeling, one is the quality and the other is the intensity. All psychical compound is the combination of elements of sensation and feeling. And then he talked about will, wherein he said that will is a feeling that leads to overt action. He also talked about the elements of consciousness, which combines by means of association, and 4 types of associations he talked about: simultaneous association, successive associations, assimilation and complications. Then he also talked about the principle of creative synthesis, wherein he said that the element of consciousness might form such a complex or compound whose characteristics are different from the characteristics of the compound elements. He also gave this law of psychic relationships. Okay. And interestingly, you would realize that it was this very principle of psychic relationship, okay, which was later on taken up by Gestalt psychologists. We will come to Gestalt psychology little later. He talked about apperception, and apperception as a phenomena, as cognition, as activity. So, according to him, stimulation leads to perception, perception leads to apperception, and apperception leads to will. Okay. And of course, he talked about psychophysical parallelism, where he talked about the interaction between the mind and the body. Remember that the apperception, the term apperception that was used by him, modern psychology uses attention word for that. The another important person in this school of thought was Titchener. He said that basically the problem of psychology is what, how and why of the phenomena. So, if you are analyzing the mental experiences and trying to break it down into simplest components, then it is what of the problem. If you are interested in process and laws that govern these mental components, then it is how of the phenomena. And if you are interested understanding the way by which mental events correlate with their physiological conditions, then it is why of the phenomena. So, basically what, how and why is the subject matter of psychology. This is Titchener's view, and he said that there are three elements of consciousness: sensations, images and affection. Sensations basically has the elements of perception, images have the elements of idea, and affection has the elements of emotion. And according to Titchener, we human beings have 42,415 different types of sensations. Okay. He talked about the basic attributes of elements of consciousness, wherein he talked about quality, intensity, clarity and duration. And he said that the primary method of investigation is either introspection or experimentation. Titchener talked about law of contiguity. Law of contiguity means the concurrence of two type of things together if one comes after the other in very close duration. So, he said that whenever a sensory or an imaginary content occurs in our conscious experiences, all those sensory or imaginary contents, they are likely to appear which happened in the past and it was contiguous. Okay. And it is basically the meaning of sensation or image, okay, which is determined by the context in which it occurs, okay, in consciousness. So, this was what is called as the context theory of meaning, and according to him, the methods that can be used to study emotion are basically the method of impression, okay, and the method of expression. By impression, he meant that when we want to compare different affective characteristics, then it is the method of impression. And if we are studying emotions, okay, on the basis of bodily changes, then you are basically trying to study emotions with respect to expressions. The fourth major school of thought in psychology was functionalism. And if you look at the list of the functionalists, it starts with William James and it goes up to Woodworth. And you have all legendaries here. Frankly speaking, functionalism was a school that came out as a protest against the structuralism. So, functionalists basically they said that behavior is adaptable, and in order to psychologically survive, any organism must be able to adjust to its environment, and their focus was more and more pragmatic. So, they said that the validation of any knowledge in psychology must be done in terms of its value and utility. Okay. They talked about mental life, or what was referred as consciousness, both as phenomena and as condition. So, the subject matter that was found in experience is the phenomena, and the base of the mental life is found in the body. And of course, they said that consciousness is continuous and a dynamic process which is very, very complex. According to functionalism, the study of human beings must be considered in their adaptive and readaptive processes that they take forward with respect to their environment. Okay. The major methods that they focused on was introspection, experimentation and the comparative method. Okay. Of course, you should remember that William James himself did not use the method of experimentation, and the famous theory, the James Lange theory of emotion, we would also talk about it when we come to the topic emotion in the coming weeks. James proposed this, and Lange, who was a Danish psychologist, also proposed a similar type of concept, and therefore the credit for this theory was shared between the two. So, this was a major concept given in by this school of thought. And then functionalism also talked about the doctrine of instinct. James said that instinct is an unlearned pattern of reaction. They are self-preservative as well as unlearned. They are modifiable by our habits, and as compared to other species, human beings have a large number of instincts. James talked about three types of selves: the spiritual self, the social self, and the material self. The spiritual self basically refers to various psychological functions. The social self basically is formed on the basis of the recognition of a person by others based on the opinion they hold about that very person, and the material self basically is our body and our personal possessions. James also talked about the primary and the secondary memory. Primary memory you can relate it to short term memory, and secondary memory you can relate it to long term memory. He talked about consciousness and suggested that fine, it is personal, always changing, a continuous and selective process which deals with objects rather than itself. And he also talked about the function that consciousness serves, and he said that basically consciousness makes human beings better adapted organisms, and when faced with new problem, it is basically consciousness that makes us adjust according to the new demand. Cattell was another important source of new concepts in this school of thought, who basically talked about two types of reaction time, sensory and the muscular reaction time. Okay. And he said that sensory type of subjects now give sensorial reaction time more quickly than the muscular reaction time. So, he was basically making a distinction between type of people based on their reaction time. But most importantly, Cattell discovered the new psychophysical method, what is called as the order of merit ranking method, and this method is widely applied in personality and psychometry. Carr was another important contributor to this school of thought, who gave three methods of study: introspection, observation, and experimentation. And he did talk about the law of repetition or law of frequency, and he said that greater repetition results into increased associative strength. Okay. And he also said that the primary agents of behavioral selection are attention, motives, and learning. The new school of thought, basically many people say that this was not basically a school of thought, but we are considering it as right now as a school of thought, was associationism. You can again divide the older and the modern school. And if you look at the list in the modern school, you again have the stalwarts who gave major theories in psychology: Ebbinghaus, Pavlov, Thorndike, Guthrie. Ebbinghaus's theory we all know, and we would be talking about it when we come to memory in the forthcoming weeks. He said that by repeating observations, the error in one direction are roughly cancelled, okay, by those in the opposite direction. And he was the one who came forward with nonsense syllables, which is till date used in the study of memory. He came forward with around 2000 nonsense syllables, and he is also given the credit of coming forward with this estimated span of memory, 7 plus minus 2. He also came forward with this concept of forgetting curve. Forgetting curve we will again talk about when we come to memory, and of course method of saving, that is the amount of effort that is needed to recall something that was already previously learned. Okay. This is again a method which we would be talking about when we come to memory. Pavlov's work again we will talk about when we come to learning. He was the one who talked about conditioned responses or reflexes, and he talked about all types of things. The very fact that the responses are associated to stimuli, the fact that higher nervous activity in the brain, they get connected, He talked about extension, spontaneous recovery, generalization, discrimination, the law of reinforcement. All these things we will be talking about when we come to learning in the coming weeks. He mentioned one thing, what he called as experimental neurosis, that was basically the failure to discriminate and complete disorganization in behavior. So, this is a very interesting concept that Pavlov talked about. Thorndike, again we would refer to him when we come to learning. He gave this famous trial and error method of learning, where he talked about learning by selection and connection. And the laws of learning, he talked about 3 laws: the law of readiness, the law of exercise, and the law of effect. So, law of readiness said that when a conduction unit is ready to conduct, conduction by it is always satisfying. Compared to this, when the conduction unit is not ready to conduct, then forceful conduction is annoying. And third condition, when the conduction unit is ready to conduct, not to conduct is again annoying. So, this is what he called as law of readiness. Law of exercise is said that with more practice, connections become much more stronger. And then of course, he talked about the law of effect, that a response that produces satisfying effect in a person is stamped in, and the response that produces annoying effect is stamped out. Okay. And law of effect is now called truncated law of effect. The next school is the behaviorists, and again you know most of these names. Watson is given the credit of being the father of behaviorism, and again whole lot of people, the major ones being Bandura, Tolman and Skinner in this group. Now, Watson of course talked about the SR component, the stimulus response component of psychology, which is always talked about. He talked about the empirical or the methodological behaviorism, which is the study of behavior rather than consciousness. Okay, and he said that this method is the major source of data for psychologists. He also talked about radical behaviorism or metaphysical behaviorism, saying that denial of the existence of mind is something that is desirable. Okay, and the focus should be basically on the behavior rather than the mind and consciousness. He said that psychology is a branch of natural science that studies human behavior, and behavior for him included even something like verbalization as well. So, the objective of Watson's behaviorism was basically to make prediction about response after knowing the stimulus, and to make prediction about the stimulus if you know the response. The methods that he suggested was observation, condition reflex technique. It was adopted basically from Pavlov and Bekhterev. The third method he talked about was testing, and the fourth method was verbal report. So, these are the 4 methods that was talked about by him. Skinner, we all know the famous Skinner box and the operant conditioning experiments. We would talk about his work at length when we come in the coming weeks to the topic of learning. His approach is basically also called as descriptive behaviorism, okay, or inductive behaviorism, and he is primarily very popular for his instrumental conditioning experiments. Albert Bandura gets another credit for introducing what is called as soft behaviorism. Okay. Skinner and Watson were called as radical behaviorist, whereas Bandura is given the credit of being the soft behaviorist. And he said that human behavior can be understood as a function of reciprocal interaction of behavior, cognition and the environmental determinants. He is considered that observational learning or modeling is one of the best ways of learning, which basically means that majority of our behavior is basically learned through copying. So, that means that a person can learn without performing a behavior. So, you just observe, you just copy and you model. This very technique we would be again talking about when we come to learning, and he also referred to self system. Basically, it refers to cognitive structure that provides reference mechanism and a set of sub functions of the perception, evaluation and regulation of behavior. Then came Gestalt psychologists. Of course, Wertheimer, Kohler, Kafka and many others get the credit. This very school talked about many concepts, but basically they are famous for the principles of primitive organization. Various principles they talked about, what are popularly called as Gestalt theory, principles of similarity, proximity, continuity, closure, objective set, figure and ground. Okay. They also talked about perceptual constancy. All of this we will be talking about when we come to the topic of perception in the coming week. Then came a major school of thought, psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud was considered as the pioneer. He is given the credit of being the father of modern psychology as well. And Adler, Jung, Horney, Erikson, they are the ones who are called as neo-Freudians. Right now, I am not going into the details of what they talked about, because when we come to the topic personality, in that very week we would be talking about various theories given by all these psychoanalysts. Okay. But you would realize that the focus completely shifted. Now, if you graphically plot what was the focus of attention of various schools of thoughts, and if you even if you start from structuralism, so structuralism to behaviorism to associationism to all these schools coming up to psychoanalysis, you will find a big change. The major school of thought which came little later was the humanistic and the existential psychologists. Two people who are popular are Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers we all know for the person centered therapy, his self theory, which is basically based on his own experience as a client centered therapist, and he talked about the organism referring to the totality of experience going on within the whole individual at a particular moment, and he talked about the locus of all the experiences within that very organism. Carl Rogers we would be talking about again when we come to personality. Again Abraham Maslow, very famous for his self actualization theory. He gave this famous need hierarchy concept. He talked about human motives which are innate and that are arranged in ascending hierarchy of priority. Gradually psychology moved towards a new school of thought which looked at the mental faculties and what is called as cognitive psychology. This was basically a revolt against behaviorism, and the entire focus was on higher mental processes. So, the cognitive psychologists, they were interested in studying what happens between the stimulus and the resulting behavior. Three basic paradigms you will find: the new structuralism, man machine relationship, and the new mentalism. Okay. These were the focus of the cognitive psychologists, and now you will find that there is whole lot of mix and matches that has taken place. If you remember last time when we were talking about various divisions of psychology and the prominent areas, the emerging areas, you could have found that psychology has expanded right from the general principles that was being observed to what not at the modern time. So, this is the whole course of development that has taken place in psychology. This was the our summary of the major schools of thoughts. Next week onwards, we would be talking exclusively on various topics. Each week would be dedicated to one major concept, and this is how we will proceed.